everybody. This video introduces you to the last novel that we'll be reading for this class, which is Lady Susan. Lady Susan was probably written between 1783 and 1784. And this is at the same time when Austen was composing her first drafts of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, which were called Elinor and Marianne and First Impressions. Unlike those other novels, and the novels we've read in this class, Lady Susan was not published during Austen's lifetime. So unlike Elinor and Marianne and and First Impressions, she never revisited Lady Susan, she never revised it, and she never sent it off to a publisher. It's possible that she didn't see the characters or story as strong enough to be revised for publication. It's also possible that she just had other ideas. So we don't really know why that is. We just have this sort of early draft that she composed when she was younger. Unlike the other novels that we've read for this class, it's an epistolary novel. So that means that it's a novel composed of letters. And epistolary novels, novels composed of letters, were actually really popular during the time that Austen wrote this first draft. They had been widely popular in the 18th century. So she's really drawing on a current tradition when she does this, although it can feel kind of foreign and funny to us. As you're reading this, it's important to remember that we don't have a third-person narrator that's interpreting characters' words or meanings for us, so we kind of have to do that ourselves. We also have to kind of read in between the lines as far as identifying the writer's tones as well. So there's times when Lady Susan may be making a joke, for example, but because she's writing in the 18th century, she doesn't have like a little emoji to tell us that she's joking. So just because she says something that's outrageous, don't necessarily believe that she actually means that. There could be places where she's being sarcastic or making jokes as well. So you have to sort of, remember that and keep that in mind when you're reading these letters. And then one other thing that makes this novel a little bit different is it's the only one of Austen's novels to feature a villain or sort of a very morally flawed person as its central protagonist. So Lady Susan, as you will discover when you start reading, is really not a very good person. She's manipulative, she's selfish, she's probably an adulteress, she's probably had at least one affair with someone who's married. So she's really different from a lot of the characters that we get in Austen's novels. What you have in front of you is a sort of family tree of two of the sort of main families that inhabit the novel. And because everyone is sort of called Mr. Vernon or Mrs. Vernon or Mr. de Courcy or Mrs. de Courcy, it can be kind of confusing and hard to keep track of these relationships. So I've sort of put this together to just sort of help you keep that in mind. So on the left side, you have the Vernons. So at some point before the novel started, there were two Vernons who were married, and they had two children. And those two children were sons. So the older son, we don't know what his name was, but he married Lady Susan, so she became Lady Susan Vernon. And then they had a daughter, Miss Frederica Vernon, who you meet in the novel. And then the other brother was Mr. Charles Vernon, who married Mrs. Catherine de Courcy, and she became Mrs. Catherine Vernon. So a lot of the letters that we see are actually written from Mrs. Vernon. So Mrs. Vernon is Lady Susan's sister-in-law. And then Mr. Vernon and Mrs. Vernon have at least two children, probably more, but there's only the two that are ever named within the novel. Mrs. Vernon, Catherine Vernon, also writes a number of letters to both her parents and her brother. So she has two parents, Mr. Reginald de Courcy and Lady de Courcy, and then her brother is also named Reginald de Courcy, so named after his father. And her brother Reginald is the one who sort of comes and visits and spends time with the Vernon family while Lady Susan is visiting. And then there's another sort of set of people that show up in the novel as well. So Mrs. Alicia Johnson is Lady Vernon's very good friend, Lady Susan's very good friend, who Lady Susan spends a lot of time writing with. she's married to Mr. Johnson, and Mr. Johnson is the guardian. So he's the one who's sort of like legally sort of responsible, or had been legally responsible for Mrs. Manwaring. And Mrs. Manwaring is married to Mr. Manwaring, who's someone that Lady Susan is romantically entangled with, even though he's married. And then they have one daughter named Miss Maria Manwaring. So that just gives you sort of, helps you figure out how all these people are connected. So there are some questions I want you to keep in mind as you make your way through Lady Susan. The first question I want you to think about is just how the experience of reading an epistolary novel, which is a novel that's made up of letters, is different than reading a third-person narrative. So I want you to think about what kind of work you have to do as a reader when you're reading an epistolary novel as opposed to a third-person narrative. Secondly, I want you to think about how the world that Lady Susan inhabits compares to the world of Austen's other novels. So do people seem to have the same lifestyles and value systems as the characters in Pride and Prejudice, or as the characters in Emma, and how so or how not so? Third, I want you to think about how Lady Susan compares to Jane Austen's other female characters. Like I said, she's definitely more immoral than most of Austen's other female characters. But beyond that, does she have anything in common with, say, Elizabeth Bennet or Emma or any of Austen's other female characters? And then fourth, some critics have argued that Lady Susan, who's sort of an intelligent, witty woman, is an attractive character despite her many moral failings. So I want you to think about whether you agree with this idea, and if so, why or why not? And then along with that, I want you to think about whether you find any of the other characters, say Mrs. Vernon or Reginald de Courcy, to be likable, or if not likable, at least interesting, and then why or why not? And then finally, I want you to think about sort of what happens to Lady Susan at the end of the novel. So in Austen's other novels, characters who behave immorally are usually severely punished for their actions. We don't see a lot of that in Pride and Prejudice or Emma, because no one in that novel, with, say, maybe the exception of Wickham, is like a really evil character. But there are sort of more sort of immoral characters that pop up in some of Austen's other novels, and those characters usually come to a really bad end. They're usually pretty severely punished for their behavior. So with that in mind, I want you to pay attention to what happens to Lady Susan at the end of the novel, and think about whether she gets away with her sort of bad behavior, or whether you think she's punished for it. So with those questions in mind, I hope that you enjoy reading Lady Susan, and I look forward to seeing what you guys think about it in discussion.